So late 19th century had a few isms, and especially in national and local politics. The big ones are populism and progressivism. Now, populism is the one that answered the changes that were happening because of further industrialization and also urbanization. So as more and more farms were closing and cities were becoming bigger and more industrialized, more attention was being directed there than to the Midwest and South and the agrarian lifestyle. So they start people from this territory begin to organize and become part of the populist movement. And you became Populist Party that won some early victories. The most famous kind of the rise and fall of the Populist Party was the rise and fall of William Jennings Bryan, who would be would run for president in 1896. He would be someone involved in American politics for the next couple of decades, but he would lose to kind of the party candidate of the Republicans, William McKinley. And McKinley would win in 1896 and steer the country further into focus on northern banks and industries, um, and kind of have a laissez-faire attitude towards them. And that would kind of end the populist movement. Now, another movement that was gaining traction is the progressive movement, and this is way more northern intellectuals and activists connected to things like journalism. So what they would do would basically be trying to raise consciousness about some of the abuses of industry. Some of these figures were called muckrakers because they would, for example, Jacob Riis went around taking pictures of the tenement apartments. So, I mean, these are really like overcrowded apartment buildings not taken care of. And so he was going around taking pictures of these places, the people occupying them in order to like raise consciousness and so to get some like progressive labor, progressive like social labor laws made. Same thing with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, basically talking about just how dehumanizing the food industry was. So that's the progressive movement. Now, the president following McKinley would be known as the first of the progressive presidents. So, progressive president is Teddy Roosevelt. Let me first go there. Well, let's first talk about this kind of dual nature of Teddy Roosevelt. The fact that he, actually, let's go back and look at his picture here. That Roosevelt was somebody who is very much the first progressive president, so somebody that was really going to like challenge labor, like the owners, the banks. He's really challenged kind of the status quo when it came to that stuff. But at the same time, he'd also be somebody who is pushing forward basically an imperialist agenda when it came to the United States. So around the U.S., you'd start to see the American military start to flex its muscles a little bit. All right. So you really start to see this as early as the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. Now, already earlier, there was a power struggle between Queen Liliuokalani and the Dole family. So you had people who had settled in Hawaii and then began to try to take social political power there until finally, in this coup, the settlers have taken over and the queen is out of a job. Um, the thinking within the U.S. Military kind of follows Mahan's idea of naval power. If you think about the late 19th century, both Germany and England have very strong navies. And again, one of these isms of the late 19th century is militarism. Whereas we're in 1890. World, just keep this in mind. World War One starts in 1911, so we're not that far away of kind of march towards World War One. And part of that, um, this whole colonial imperial world that Europe is carving out at the time, is based on building up these militaries. So what Mahan is tapping into is just this idea that the United States is now, has to kind of basically explore outside of its border. And so the Cuban Spanish Filipino war, is going on. Both the Philippines and Cuba are trying to gain independence from Spain. Spain is an old a colonizing power. Cuba is basically the last of its colonial possessions from all the way back to 1492. And now they're trying to get independence. And Spain is, um, doing, frankly, atrocities to the Cuban people on the island. So that the stories of those, and then finally the explosion of the vessel Maine, which probably an accident, but it's blamed on the Spanish, via yellow journalism. This pushes, the Americans to, get involved in this conflict. Now, yellow journalism is just a, way to describe the journalism of the late 19th century, where it's very sensationalistic, and pushing for, certain agendas. Um, so and in this particular case, it's war with Spain. So U.S. intervenes, and frankly, Teddy Roosevelt is actually part of this intervention. He leads a group of soldiers known as the Rough Riders, and, kind of makes his name off of this. So the U.S. helps liberate Cuba. Cuba is independent. However, with the Platt Amendment, the United States can intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it wants to. And that's going to be the situation all the way to, FDR's administration. So we're talking 1930s. And frankly, the U.S. will intervene during, some of these, years where, people are up for vote and it looks controversial. U.S. will intervene. The U.S. also gains access and actually, control over Puerto Rico, which is in the, by Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines. So, they also get now territory in Asia. Um, Now the Philippines is really interesting because it's actually the context of Rudyard Kipling's famous "White Man's Burden" poem, where he basically says, like, look, uh, the U.S., it's your duty to go in and basically civilize the Philippines with your presence. And the Philippines, really don't want the U.S. there. They were finding independence before the U.S. got involved, and were grateful for the U.S. help, but frankly wanted to, kind of be autonomous, independent. And so, this then brought a little short war, with the Philippines between 1899 and 1903, with the U.S. basically keeping the Philippines as a colony. Um, so, if you remember from the last lecture of all the, laws against Asian migration, because of the U.S. controlling the Philippines, Filipino, migration into the United States continues. It's the last one to actually continue before even that one is put on hold. Um, and even within World War II, there's quite the, intervention, and with the Japanese taking it over at one point, and the U.S. trying to help liberate it. So Philippines is very much attached to U.S. history, and as you can see, the U.S. is in around the Caribbean, and now it is off in Asia as well. So very much like what the European powers are doing, the U.S. is now starting to flex imperialist muscle. All right, so Roosevelt comes to the office of presidency because McKinley is assassinated. So, frankly, they put Teddy as the VP to McKinley because they thought, okay, great, this will be a place he can't really do any damage. And so he becomes president because of McKinley's assassination, and he comes in basically as a kind of a pushy president, one of the first real pushy presidents of the modern era. So it's really convenient that he becomes president at the beginning of the 20th century, because more so than ever, the executive branch of the U.S. government is kind of the face of the government, and really, the media pays most attention to it. So, and so Teddy pops up at a time period where, frankly, the last most meaningful executive is probably Abraham Lincoln. If you think about like what presidents you know of, maybe U.S. Grant, but the other ones don't really have as big of a impact. Um, because in some ways they're hands off with the rise of industry and big money, big business. The whole gilded age stuff. So Roosevelt comes in and he's about to take on the corporations. He's going to be a trust buster. He intervenes in the coal strike in 1902. Basically, he's the first president to actually back up labor, right? Because there's a labor strike over coal. The owners are going to basically be hardliners about it, and Roosevelt says he's going to intervene and make the owners pay. So he's very much the first president to really go on the side of organized labor. He tries to regulate the economy and even takes on one of the big robber barons, J.P. Morgan. So the other thing he's important is he does push for protection of the industries. We still have this today. Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act in 1906. I mean, we still get FDA approved meat, right? So he's the first to come in and do that. Um, I'll go back to the Roosevelt corollary in a second, but this third part, he's a conservationist. He's the first president to kind of say halt to the rise of industry and urbanization. He pushes the Antiquities Act of 1906. So things like Yellowstone Park. These are public monuments that he wants conserved, and because he's a big outdoorsy guy. So it's thanks to him we have some of these public landmarks. Um, so what about the imperialism? So you already saw that he ran off to Cuba to go fight with the Rough Riders. And so he has a very what they call bully pulpit and big stick type of mentality with not just Americans and the press and whatnot, but also even with foreign affairs. So he is going to update the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the United States is going to handle the affairs of the Americas. So all the Americas are under the watchful eye of the United States. Like Roosevelt basically just states it. But you see him get involved in the Panama Revolution. Panama breaks off from Colombia and declares independence, and the Americans are going to go in and help build this canal. But with Roosevelt, who actually shows up into the Panama Canal, he will take U.S. ownership over the canal, and that'll be the case all the way till 1979, or at least around. For sure, it's during the Carter administration. So very big stick diplomacy. He basically lets the Latin American world at least know who's in charge, and this is big stick diplomacy. He's not going to mess around. Um, he does, by the way, end up with a Nobel Peace Prize because he intervenes in the Japanese-Russian War of 1905 and negotiates peace. So he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So that's the end of the 19th century. Now moving to the 20th century. Next week we'll be talking about World War One and the Harlem Renaissance, and then moving towards World War Two. So that's what we got